Agent Tasha Brooks had been tracking a complex smuggling ring across multiple states for days, barely catching a few hours of sleep between interrogations and investigations. The weight of the case hung heavily on her shoulders, but she couldn't afford to slow down, not when so many lives were at stake. Finally, after a long stretch of work, she was on a flight from Portland to Atlanta, hoping for a brief respite during the flight. Tasha settled into her seat, her eyes heavy with fatigue as the airplane began its ascent. She'd been on countless flights during her career, but this one felt different. Tasha just wanted to close her eyes and rest for the first time in days, to sleep through the hum of the engines and forget about the high-stakes case she was entangled in. But, as the flight continued, it became clear that her brief escape from the stress would be interrupted by more than just the fatigue in her bones. As she tried to relax, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to unfold, something that would pull her back into the chaos that had consumed her life for the past few weeks. The journey would be anything but peaceful. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. If this story made you reflect, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful content. Tasha had barely closed her eyes when a disturbance caught her attention. The man seated in front of her, Gregory Phelps, a middle-aged businessman with a pompous air about him, was arguing with the flight attendant, Lena. He had been assigned a seat in economy class, but upon boarding, he insisted that he was supposed to be in first class. Tasha could hear the growing tension as Phelps raised his voice, his entitlement apparent in every word. Lena, doing her best to remain calm, explained that the first-class seats had already been assigned and there were no upgrades available, but Phelps wasn't having it. His face turned red as he pressed the issue, demanding to speak to a supervisor. Tasha watched the exchange with a growing sense of irritation. This wasn't the first time she had witnessed a passenger's sense of privilege overshadowing basic decency. The interaction escalated, drawing attention from other passengers, though no one dared to intervene. The flight attendants tried to handle the situation professionally, but Phelps' increasingly loud complaints left the cabin uneasy. Tasha could feel her patience thinning. She wasn't in the mood for this kind of disruption, and with all that had already been weighing on her, she found herself wishing for a smooth, uneventful flight, something that seemed increasingly unlikely. Gregory Phelps, who had now introduced himself as a frequent flyer and valued customer, continued to argue with Lena. His insistence on sitting in first class didn't just reveal his frustration over a miscommunication, it exposed a deep-seated sense of entitlement. As he held his ground, leaning closer to Lena, his words were laced with the unmistakable arrogance that came from years of being catered to in the most exclusive of settings. "You don't understand," Phelps snapped. "I've flown this route every month for the last 5 years. I'm supposed to be in first class. I paid for that privilege." The flight attendant, Lena, remained calm but firm, offering him an alternative seat in economy with a polite but unwavering smile. Still, Phelps wasn't satisfied. His behavior quickly became a spectacle in the cabin, drawing the attention of other passengers. Tasha, watching the exchange unfold in front of her, couldn't help but feel the frustration rising within her. She had dealt with plenty of entitled individuals during her investigations, and the behavior of someone like Phelps, who believed that rules didn't apply to him, was all too familiar. As the conversation between Phelps and Lena continued to escalate, Tasha noticed the underlying tone of entitlement in Phelps' voice, the belief that his status automatically granted him special treatment. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about the assertion of control over others, an attitude that made Tasha uneasy. In that moment, Tasha knew this wasn't just another case of a disgruntled passenger, it was a glimpse into a mindset she had encountered before, one that was willing to use privilege to manipulate situations. What Tasha didn't know was that this encounter would soon pull her into a much darker and more dangerous situation than she could have imagined. As the altercation between Gregory Phelps and the flight attendants dragged on, Tasha tried to force herself to focus on something else. But her mind kept drifting back to the scene unfolding in front of her. She wasn't sure whether it was the growing tension between Phelps and Lena or the stress from her exhausting case that had made her more sensitive to the unpleasant atmosphere. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't long before another confrontation broke out on the opposite side of the cabin, drawing Tasha's attention. An elderly white woman, Mrs. Margaret Scott, was engaged in a heated exchange with a young Middle Eastern man sitting beside her. At first, Tasha hadn't thought much of it. She was used to the occasional irritability among passengers, especially on long flights, but as she overheard snippets of their conversation, her stomach sank. "I don't care what your name is," Mrs. Scott sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're probably one of those people who thinks you're entitled to everything just because you came here illegally." The young man, visibly taken aback, tried to respond calmly. "Ma'am, I don't know what you mean, but no," Mrs. Scott interrupted sharply. "You're all the same. Coming into our country, taking our jobs, and ruining everything for real citizens. Maybe you should go back to where you came from." The words were like a slap in the face to Tasha. Her blood boiled as she witnessed the woman's blatant racism, and yet, she noticed that no one else seemed willing to step in. The other passengers either looked away in discomfort or remained silent, unwilling to challenge the situation. Tasha's eyes narrowed as she observed the young man's reaction. His face reddened, and he clenched his fists, though he was doing his best to stay calm and composed. But it was clear that the hurtful words were beginning to take their toll on him. As the exchange continued, Tasha's frustration grew. She had dealt with bigotry in many forms throughout her career, but this was different. It was happening right before her, on a flight that was supposed to be a peaceful journey, not a battleground for racial tension. Tasha glanced at the flight attendants, hoping one of them would intervene, but they were occupied with Phelps and his tantrum, leaving the situation to escalate unchecked. Tasha had never been one to back down in the face of injustice, but in this moment, she wasn't sure how to proceed. She wasn't on duty, and technically, this wasn't her case. Yet, her sense of duty as an FBI agent, and simply as a decent human being, compelled her to act. She couldn't just sit there and allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked. After a few more hateful words from Mrs. Scott, Tasha finally stood up. She approached the row where the confrontation was happening, her eyes focused on the elderly woman. Mrs. Scott hadn't noticed Tasha's approach, but the young man had, and he gave her a look of quiet gratitude. "Ma'am," Tasha said firmly, her voice carrying the authority that came with years of service. "That's enough. There is no place for that kind of language here." Mrs. Scott turned her head, startled by the interruption, but Tasha didn't back down. She stood her ground, her posture strong, her eyes unwavering. "You're making this man uncomfortable, and you're out of line. I suggest you stop before this becomes a bigger issue." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Mrs. Scott opened her mouth, clearly preparing for a sharp retort, but then she hesitated. Something in Tasha's demeanor made her rethink her words. Tasha had always known how to exert authority without raising her voice, and her calm yet unwavering presence seemed to have the desired effect. After a tense moment, Mrs. Scott muttered something under her breath, something less than polite but not nearly as offensive as before, and slumped back into her seat. The young man, though still visibly shaken, nodded his thanks to Tasha. Tasha returned to her seat, but she didn't sit back comfortably. The incident, although resolved for the moment, lingered in her mind. She had seen so much injustice in her career, but what bothered her the most was how often people allowed these incidents to unfold without so much as a word. She had done what she could, but she was left with the unsettling feeling that the bigger battle, against racism, against hate, was far from over. As the flight continued its journey, Tasha turned her attention back to Phelps, who was still arguing about his seat. The entire situation was a reminder of the personal work still left to do, both in her career and in the world. But Tasha was a fighter. She had always been one to stand up, even when it felt like the fight was impossible. And as the airplane continued its course toward Atlanta, she couldn't shake the sense that more would soon be required of her, and this time, it might be bigger than anything she had ever faced before. The tension on the flight had started to build, with confrontations and unpleasant encounters unfolding one after another. Tasha Brooks, who had just dealt with the heated altercation involving Mrs. Scott and the young man, hoped for a moment of respite. She sank back into her seat, wishing for a brief break in the chaos. She just needed to close her eyes and reset. After all, the real work that lay ahead of her when she landed in Atlanta would be anything but restful. But just as she began to drift off, a loud call over the intercom broke the silence. The voice of one of the flight attendants, Lena, sounded urgent. "Is there a doctor or medical professional on board? We have an emergency situation in the cabin." Tasha's senses immediately heightened. She was no doctor, but as an FBI agent, she had been trained to handle a variety of high-stress situations. Her instincts kicked in, and she rose from her seat without a second thought. Whatever was happening in the cabin, she knew she had to be involved. She glanced toward the back of the plane, where she could see a group of passengers crowding around a row of seats. It wasn't hard to identify where the emergency was unfolding. An elderly man was lying uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale and his body rigid. Tasha moved toward the scene, navigating past passengers who were whispering among themselves. There was a sense of urgency in the air, but the uncertainty was palpable. As Tasha approached, she could see that the man, Walter Simmons, was struggling to breathe. His chest was rising and falling unevenly, and there was a terrifying stillness in the way his hands rested on his lap, unable to move. Lena was at his side, trying to keep calm but clearly out of her depth. "He's been having chest pains for the last few minutes," she explained to Tasha as she knelt beside the elderly man. "He suddenly collapsed into his seat, and now he's unresponsive." Tasha immediately assessed the situation. She could tell that the man was likely experiencing a heart attack, his condition serious enough that every second counted. She pushed past her exhaustion and focused, instinctively slipping into the role of the problem solver. "Can someone bring me the oxygen mask?" she called out, her voice commanding. She turned back to Lena, who was still hovering nervously. "Get some ice for his chest. Keep him as calm as possible." Tasha's attention was fully on Walter Simmons now. She checked his pulse, which was weak and irregular. His skin had taken on an ashen hue, and beads of sweat formed along his forehead. "Stay with me, sir," Tasha muttered under her breath, though her focus remained on his vitals. The only thing she could do for him right now was to keep him stable long enough for them to land. As she worked, she heard Lena on the intercom, speaking to the rest of the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're diverting to Charlotte immediately due to a medical emergency. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll update you as soon as we can." The plane was already descending, the turbulence increasing as the pilots adjusted the flight path for the emergency landing. Tasha could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't just a case of stabilizing a passenger, it was a matter of getting them to safety, and fast. Within moments, a flight attendant brought over the oxygen mask and a first aid kit. Tasha connected the oxygen and gently placed the mask over Walter's face, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened to the strained, labored sounds of his breathing. She looked up at Lena. "We need to make sure they're ready for an emergency landing. I'm going to need medical personnel as soon as we land." Lena nodded, her face a mixture of fear and relief. "We're almost there," she said. "Thank you." As Tasha continued to assist, she felt her mind racing through possible outcomes, calculating the urgency of the situation. Time was their enemy, and the odds of getting Walter the help he needed within the next few minutes were slim. The plane was now moving into a steep descent, and the cockpit had notified the cabin crew of the emergency landing. Tasha's mind briefly drifted to her own personal exhaustion. This case, the long hours, and the exhausting chase across multiple states had taken its toll. But the weight of the man's life in her hands pushed everything else aside. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. Despite Tasha's best efforts, Walter Simmons wasn't improving. His pulse remained weak, his breathing shallow, and every breath he took seemed to be more of a struggle than the last. The flight attendants continued to make preparations, urging passengers to remain calm and secure their seatbelts. Finally, the plane touched down with a thud. The emergency lights flickered on, and Tasha could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching on the tarmac. She could only hope that the medical team would be able to stabilize Walter once he was off the plane. As soon as the plane came to a full stop, the cabin doors were opened, and the emergency medical team boarded the plane swiftly, moving with professional precision. They quickly took over from Tasha, assessing Walter's condition and transporting him to a waiting ambulance. Tasha watched them go, feeling a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The flight attendants began reassuring the passengers, though Tasha knew that the ripple effects of this medical emergency would last long after they had landed safely. She returned to her seat, her thoughts momentarily consumed by the life that had been in danger just moments before. The scene had reminded her of how fragile life was, how every minute could mean the difference between life and death. As the plane idled on the runway, Tasha let out a quiet sigh. She was thankful that Walter had been given a chance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming, something far more dangerous than a medical emergency. She could sense it in the air. Whatever was going to happen next, she would be ready. For now, though, all she could do was wait for the next turn in the story. As the airplane finally landed in Charlotte, the emergency medical team whisked Walter Simmons off to the hospital. The passengers who had witnessed the incident were still in a state of unease, many of them staring quietly at the empty seat where Walter had been. The chaos of the medical emergency had subsided for the moment, but Tasha felt the tension still lingering in the cabin. Despite the immediate danger having passed, her mind kept drifting back to the strange exchange that had occurred between Gregory Phelps and the flight attendants earlier. She was trained to notice patterns, to be observant, and to trust her instincts. Something about Gregory had unsettled her, even before the confrontations began. It wasn't just his entitled attitude over the seat, there was a particular edge to his demeanor that set her on alert. Tasha settled into her seat again, letting out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The chaotic events of the flight had been distracting, but she needed to clear her mind. She pulled out her notebook and began reviewing her case files once more, trying to focus on something that could take her mind off the disquieting feeling in her gut. But her attention was continually drawn back to Gregory. She had seen enough to know that this man, though seemingly just an irritable passenger, was tied to something larger. As the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began moving around the cabin, Tasha's eyes caught Gregory once more. He was sitting in the aisle seat, speaking in hushed tones to a woman in her mid-30s who had just boarded the plane in Charlotte. The woman was well-dressed, looking sharp in a navy business suit. Gregory, however, was talking to her in a way that made Tasha's instincts scream. Though she couldn't hear every word, she noticed the exchange was oddly formal, with Gregory speaking in clipped sentences. From what she could gather, he was discussing a shipment that needed to be processed immediately. His tone was too cold, too deliberate. The context seemed innocuous at first, but Tasha couldn't ignore the undercurrent of something sinister. A shipment wasn't a casual term for most people, it was a coded reference she had heard in criminal investigations before. She overheard Gregory mentioning how it had to be ready by tomorrow, no delays, no questions. His companion nodded in agreement, her response muted and professional, but her eyes held an edge that matched Gregory's cold demeanor. Tasha's curiosity deepened as she overheard more about their discussion. They spoke in passing about someone named Adams, someone who apparently was critical to the deal, and that Adams would make sure the next step goes smoothly. The woman, though calm and collected, kept her voice low, glancing around nervously as if to make sure no one was eavesdropping. Tasha's instincts flared. Shipment wasn't just about moving goods, it was the kind of language used in human trafficking or illicit trading rings. Given her experience in investigating organized crime and trafficking, she couldn't ignore the way this conversation resonated with her previous cases. It sounded too much like the operations she had been tracking for weeks, the ones that had led her across 4 states, which now seemed too close to her. Her exhaustion, once so overwhelming, was forgotten as the adrenaline of a new lead took over. She leaned back in her seat, listening closely to every word. But then, as if sensing her attention, Gregory turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing for just a moment. Tasha quickly looked down at her notebook, pretending to take notes. She didn't want to alert him to the fact that she had been listening in. The conversation ended abruptly as Gregory excused himself to go to the restroom. The woman, however, lingered for a moment longer, her eyes darting around the cabin again, as if looking for something, or someone. Tasha couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an air of tension between the two of them that suggested this wasn't a casual meeting. This was something far more calculated. Once Gregory was out of sight, Tasha slipped out of her seat and approached the woman. She needed to gather more information without raising suspicion. As she walked past the woman, she caught a glimpse of her face, which was momentarily softened by something, fear, maybe. Tasha sat back down in her seat, her mind racing. She hadn't been able to get enough information from the conversation itself, but there was no mistaking it now. Gregory and his mysterious companion were involved in something far more dangerous than just a simple dispute over a seat. The conversation had hinted at more than just shipping goods, it was about managing a process, keeping it on track. The timing of this, just after the medical emergency and with the plane making an unexpected detour, was unsettling. She pulled out her phone discreetly, texting a contact back at the FBI's human trafficking unit. She knew it was a long shot to get real details from just a few overheard phrases, but she had learned not to dismiss the smallest leads. The text she sent was simple: possible trafficking connection, Gregory Phelps. Need background on him and the shipment. Tasha didn't know whether she was overreacting, but in her experience, it was better to be safe than sorry. She couldn't ignore the growing web of connections that had begun to surface, and the disturbing undertones of Gregory's conversation were too much to dismiss. As the plane prepared for landing, Tasha felt a pang of uncertainty, an unsettling feeling that she had walked into something far bigger than she had realized. She had been investigating a trafficking ring for weeks, following the breadcrumb trail across state lines, but this moment, the glimpse of something she couldn't yet fully understand, was the most dangerous yet. She had no idea where this would lead, but she had a sinking feeling it would take her somewhere far more perilous than she could have anticipated. In that moment, Tasha knew that the real battle was just beginning. The plane touched down in Charlotte with the emergency landing barely behind them, and the passengers disembarked, their nerves still tingling from the incident. Tasha Brooks remained in her seat, her mind whirring as she thought back to the unsettling conversation she had overheard between Gregory Phelps and his mysterious associate. She knew, without a doubt, that what she had witnessed wasn't just a casual business deal, it was the kind of exchange that only criminals involved in illicit activities would have. The clues were mounting, and Tasha knew she needed to act quickly before they disappeared into the wind. The situation had escalated much faster than she had anticipated. After all, she'd boarded the flight simply hoping for a brief respite from the exhausting human trafficking case she had been tracking for weeks. But now, she found herself in the middle of something far more dangerous, something that went deeper than a trivial first-class dispute. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together in a way that made her uneasy, and she felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. The passengers were slowly getting off the plane, their voices filled with relief and quiet chatter as they moved toward the terminal. Tasha, still deep in thought, was lost in the connection she had just uncovered between Gregory and his mysterious conversation. What was this shipment they were talking about? And who exactly were they working with? These questions swirled around her mind, but there was no time for answers yet. She had to make sure she was in control of the situation before it spiraled any further. She looked around, scanning the area for any sign of the woman Gregory had been speaking with. Tasha needed to know more, perhaps even get a name, a connection, or a lead. But as the crowd of passengers thickened in the terminal, the woman had disappeared from sight. Tasha knew that if she wanted answers, she would need to talk to someone who had the ability to pull the information she needed. Lena, the flight attendant who had been helping with the medical emergency earlier, was walking toward the crew area. Tasha followed her at a careful distance, catching up just as Lena reached the door to the staff lounge. Tasha tapped her gently on the shoulder, and Lena turned with a surprised look. "Oh, hey, you're the agent, right?" Lena asked, her voice calm but with an underlying tension from the earlier chaos. "Are you okay? I heard the news about the passenger being taken off for medical help. That was a close call." Tasha nodded, offering a brief smile. "Yeah, we got lucky. But now, I need to talk to you about something else." Lena raised an eyebrow, stepping aside so Tasha could enter the lounge with her. She closed the door behind them, and Tasha immediately locked eyes with her. "I'm with the FBI, Tasha said quietly, her tone serious. "And I think there's more going on here than we realized. That man, Gregory Phelps, and the woman he was speaking with, there's something very wrong with that conversation." Lena looked confused, but also intrigued. "Gregory? The guy who was causing all the fuss about his seat? What do you mean, something wrong?" "I overheard part of their conversation," Tasha explained. "He was discussing a shipment, and the way he was speaking, the words he used, the tone, this isn't just about business. I think he's involved in something illegal, something connected to trafficking, possibly." Lena blinked, taking a moment to process the information. "Wait, trafficking? Are you saying?" Tasha nodded, her expression grim. "I'm saying that they're involved in something bigger than what appears on the surface. And I think they're operating under the radar, using this flight as a cover. I need to know everything you can tell me about them." Lena hesitated for a moment, glancing around the small lounge nervously. "I don't know much, honestly. I just know he's a regular on this route. Comes in every couple of weeks, always the same first-class seat, always the same kind of attitude. He's rude to us sometimes, but other than that, I've never seen him do anything wrong." Tasha didn't want to let that dissuade her, though. She had already seen enough to know that sometimes, the most unassuming people were the ones behind the darkest schemes. "What about the woman he was speaking with? Do you recognize her? Is she with him often?" Lena shook her head. "I've never seen her before. She wasn't on the passenger list for the flight, either. So, I don't know if she was just visiting or if she was connected to him somehow." Tasha frowned, already mentally preparing for the next steps. She had no way of knowing whether Gregory's associate had simply been passing through or if she was an integral part of whatever operation Gregory was running. Either way, it was clear to Tasha that she couldn't afford to let this lead slip away. Tasha turned to Lena, her voice low. "I need you to file a report about what you saw with Gregory Phelps and the woman. If we're going to track them down, I'll need everything you've got, including any possible connections to other flights or companies he's been associated with. Can you help with that?" Lena bit her lip, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I can write up something, but I don't know if I can give you much more than what I've already told you. It's just a feeling, really." "Good," Tasha said, her voice firm. "A feeling is enough. I'll be in touch with you soon. Don't leave the airport yet. I'll need you to be available in case I need to follow up." Lena nodded, her eyes narrowing in thought. "Okay. I can do that." As Tasha exited the lounge, she felt the weight of the situation settle in. She had just crossed the line from observing a potential crime to actively investigating it. Gregory Phelps wasn't just an irritated passenger anymore. He was a piece of a much larger puzzle. The idea that a human trafficking operation could be operating out of something as routine as a flight was both terrifying and maddening. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. She quickly pulled it out to see a text from her contact in the human trafficking unit back at the FBI, Phelps. Connection to several past investigations. Stay sharp. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. The name had surfaced before, in the same circles of crime she had been tracking for months. But this time, she had to go beyond just the facts. She had to go after the source, the network. The real game was only beginning, and Tasha was more determined than ever to see it through. She exhaled sharply. There was no turning back now. Whatever Gregory Phelps was involved in, she was going to find out, and she wasn't going to stop until she did. The hum of the airplane engines was a distant sound as Tasha Brooks made her way through the terminal in Charlotte. The chaos of the medical emergency earlier was now behind her, and she was back on the ground, both literally and figuratively. The weight of the events unfolding around her pressed down, and Tasha knew that things were not going to be as simple as a few overheard conversations. The deeper she looked into Gregory Phelps, the more she realized that she had stumbled into something far darker and more dangerous than she had imagined. Tasha had left the plane with her mind racing. She had gathered some preliminary information from the flight attendants, especially from Lena, who had been kind enough to share her suspicions about Gregory. The little bit of intelligence she had on him was enough to connect the dots and realize she was no longer dealing with an entitled passenger throwing a tantrum over seating arrangements. Gregory Phelps was linked to something much more insidious, and his conversation on the plane confirmed her fears. A shipment, a name, these were all phrases that signaled something much deeper, something criminal, and it was all happening right in front of her. Tasha knew she couldn't go on her hunches alone. She needed concrete evidence, and fast. As she reached the crowded part of the terminal, she heard the unmistakable sound of a phone ringing. Pulling out her own device, Tasha saw a text from her contact at the FBI's Human Trafficking Unit, Gregory Phelps. Known associate of several individuals under investigation. Possible connection to recent cross-state trafficking operations. Stay close. Her heart skipped a beat. She had suspected that Gregory's connections were deeper than they appeared, but seeing it confirmed in writing made the whole situation feel even more urgent. If Gregory was involved in trafficking, especially at the scale her contact implied, it would change everything. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a coordinated operation, and Gregory was a key player. Tasha immediately dialed the number of her FBI contact, a trusted agent named Ray McCall. She needed all the information she could get to piece this together. McCall, his voice crackled over the line, "What's going on?" "I've got a lead on Gregory Phelps," Tasha said, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting attention. "He's connected to a shipment that looks like it could involve human trafficking. I've overheard some of his conversations with a woman on the plane, and from what I've gathered, it's more than just a casual exchange." There was a pause on the line, then McCall responded. "I've got some files on him, but nothing that ties him directly to anything this big. There's mention of him in multiple investigations, but we've never had enough to make a case stick. He's always been a step ahead." Tasha could hear the frustration in his voice, but she also felt a sense of determination rising in her own chest. She couldn't back down now. "I'm going after him, McCall. If he's involved in trafficking, I'm not letting this slip through my fingers. I'm going to need backup, resources, anything you can get me. We'll start pulling the records, Tasha. I'll get you what you need, but you've got to be careful. This isn't a small-time operation. Phelps has connections we're still trying to track down." Tasha's grip tightened on her phone. "I know. I'm not stopping until I have him. If I need to make a move, I'll do it." She ended the call and glanced around, her senses alert. She had no idea what was waiting for her next, but she knew she was walking into a hornet's nest. This wasn't just a case of a few bad actors, it was an intricate web of corruption, one that reached far beyond what she could see on the surface. She had seen the way Gregory operated, the confidence he exuded, and the importance he placed on the shipment. These weren't the actions of a man simply flying from one city to another. Gregory was part of something much larger, and Tasha was going to expose it. Back at the airport terminal, the normal rush of travelers filled the space, unaware of the dangerous game that was unfolding just above them. As Tasha prepared to move toward the next phase of her investigation, she made a mental note to check in with Lena again. If Gregory had any other patterns, any previous connections to flights or other operations, Lena might be able to provide it. The woman's information might be more valuable than she realized. Tasha also knew that Gregory was likely in Charlotte for more than just a layover. He had a purpose, whether it was picking up something or meeting with someone, and she needed to figure out where that purpose would lead her. But there was no time to waste. The more time passed, the more the conspiracy could grow, and the fewer chances she'd have to catch it before it spread. As Tasha made her way to a quiet corner of the terminal, she pulled out her phone again, checking the flight records for Gregory's most recent trips. If he was involved in trafficking, it was likely he had crossed state lines repeatedly, following a route that had become routine for him. She knew the airlines kept extensive records, and with the right push, she could access the data she needed. Her phone buzzed again, this time, an alert from her contact at the airport security desk. "Tasha, we've found something." Gregory Phelps was seen meeting with a known associate at the gate. They were discussing the shipment. "We're pulling up footage of the conversation." Her pulse quickened. This was it. The lead she needed to close in on Gregory and his associates. "Get me that footage," Tasha responded, her voice urgent. "And make sure you're pulling up his records now. We don't have much time." As the footage came through, Tasha scanned it carefully. Gregory was indeed meeting with someone, this time, a man in his late 40s with a sharp business suit. The exchange seemed innocent enough, but Tasha knew better than to rely on appearances. She caught the words, "tomorrow," and "shipment," just as she had overheard before. It was becoming clear, this wasn't about a simple transaction, it was a coordinated effort to move people, to exploit them, and to hide it behind a facade of legitimate business. Tasha felt a growing sense of urgency. She wasn't just looking at one man anymore. She was looking at a network of people, and Gregory Phelps was just one cog in a much larger machine. Her instincts told her she was close, too close to let it slip away. Tasha's phone buzzed one last time, and this time it was McCall. "We've got a lead, Tasha. His associate, the woman you saw, is linked to several other trafficking operations across the region. We've just found the connections." Tasha took a deep breath, the weight of the discovery settling in. The conspiracy was much larger than she'd ever imagined. But now, she had the pieces to break it wide open. "We need to move fast," Tasha said, determination in her voice. "I'm going after them." The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. And now, it was time to bring the whole operation down. Tasha Brooks was sitting in a quiet corner of the airport terminal, her phone in her hand, her mind racing. The more pieces of the puzzle she uncovered, the clearer it became, the operation she had stumbled upon was far bigger than she had originally thought. Gregory Phelps, the seemingly entitled businessman, was just one piece of a much larger network. The woman he had been speaking with, Elaine Bishop, was tied to multiple trafficking operations, and the trail led straight to some of the most powerful people in the country. Tasha's phone buzzed again. It was a text from her contact in the human trafficking unit at the FBI. "We've tracked down more information on Phelps and Bishop. We have a match. Connections to high-level corruption, including within government agencies. This goes deeper than we thought." Tasha's heart raced as she read the message. High-level corruption. This was no longer just a criminal network, this was a conspiracy that reached the very top. She had been investigating human trafficking for months, but this was a whole new level of danger. She stood up, her gaze fixed on the screen. The FBI had already begun pulling all the necessary strings. Information was coming in fast now, but Tasha knew they didn't have much time. She couldn't wait for the system to catch up. She needed to act. She made her way toward the gates, looking for Gregory Phelps. From the records she had accessed, she knew he had a connection to a private jet waiting nearby. The question now was whether he was planning to leave Charlotte before the authorities had the chance to move in. Tasha couldn't let that happen. As she approached the gate area, her eyes scanned the crowd. She spotted Gregory first, standing near the entrance to a lounge, talking to a man in a dark suit. They exchanged brief words, and the man handed Gregory a small briefcase. Tasha's gut told her that this wasn't just a business transaction, it was something much more serious. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from McCall. "Tasha, we've got a situation," McCall's voice came through the line, urgent. "Phelps has connections, direct ones, with federal agents involved in this trafficking ring. We're pulling records now, but we need to move quickly. He's probably getting ready to leave the airport." "I know," Tasha replied, her voice steady despite the panic rising inside her. "I've got him in sight. He's with another contact. I'm going to move in." McCall's voice was tense. "Be careful. We're not sure who's on the other side of this yet. But we know it's bigger than Phelps. Don't take any risks." Tasha didn't need the reminder. She had known from the moment she overheard Gregory's conversation that this was bigger than she could have anticipated. She wasn't just tracking a criminal anymore, she was uncovering a network of corruption that spanned agencies, and it seemed to be tied to some of the most powerful figures in the country. Gregory was moving toward the lounge entrance now, the briefcase still in his hand. Tasha couldn't let him get away. She knew if he boarded that jet, it would be impossible to track him again. Her body went into autopilot as she followed him at a careful distance. She had to act quickly, but she had to be smart. She couldn't just walk up and arrest him, not with his connections, not with the power behind him. The last thing she needed was to draw attention to herself. She stepped into the lounge just behind him, blending into the crowd of people waiting for their flights. Gregory was speaking to a woman now, a sharp-dressed figure who seemed more focused on the briefcase than on the conversation. Tasha moved closer, listening intently. "I'll have the transfer ready for you by tomorrow," Gregory was saying, his tone businesslike. "Everything will be in place. Just get the product to the warehouse, and we'll handle the rest." The product. The words made Tasha's blood run cold. She had suspected trafficking, but this confirmed it. Product wasn't code for anything but people. This wasn't just a shady business deal, this was a human trafficking operation, and the scope was staggering. Tasha's hand instinctively moved toward her concealed weapon, but she hesitated. She needed to gather more evidence first. The woman Gregory was speaking with, Elaine Bishop, wasn't just a courier in this operation. She was a key player, and Tasha needed to get closer to understand her role. She took a deep breath, careful not to make a sound, and sidled closer to the group. She knew this could be her only chance to get the information she needed. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again, this time a message from McCall. "Bishop has connections to high-level FBI officials. She's the link between Phelps and the agency. Do not engage unless you have backup." Tasha's pulse quickened. The very agency she worked for was involved. She was treading a dangerous line. But there was no turning back now. This was the moment when everything she had been working toward came into focus. Gregory and Elaine exchanged the briefcase, and Tasha's eyes darted to the contents, trying to make out what was inside. She could see a few documents, official-looking papers, and what appeared to be a hard drive. Evidence. She had to get her hands on that. Just as she took a step forward, a voice behind her startled her. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" Tasha spun around to face an airport security guard, his hand hovering near his belt. Her heart skipped a beat. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, putting on her best calm face. "I thought I saw someone I knew. Just catching my breath." The guard eyed her for a moment, then nodded and turned away. Tasha exhaled, her nerves still raw. That had been too close. She couldn't afford another moment like that. She had to move. Gregory and Elaine were about to leave the lounge when Tasha decided it was time. She couldn't let them walk away. She had to stop them now, before they disappeared for good. But she couldn't do it alone. Tasha pulled out her phone again, quickly sending a message to McCall, "Need backup now. They're leaving. I can't wait." She moved toward the exit, ready to make her move. Just as Gregory stepped through the door, a group of FBI agents, including McCall, appeared from behind her, flanking the area. It was now or never. FBI. Stop! Tasha shouted, as McCall and the team rushed forward, closing in on Gregory and Elaine. The moment was electric. Gregory's face turned pale, and Elaine's expression hardened as she realized they had been caught. The briefcase dropped to the ground with a heavy thud. "End of the line," Tasha said, her voice calm and resolute. She knew this was just the beginning, this operation, this conspiracy, it would take everything she had to bring it all down. But today, they had won a crucial victory. The evidence was in hand, and the network was exposed. As the agents took Gregory and Elaine into custody, Tasha felt a sense of relief, but it was fleeting. She knew there was still more to uncover, and the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The conspiracy had been uncovered. Now, it was time to bring down the rest of the network. Tasha Brooks stood in front of a crowded room at the FBI headquarters, the weight of everything she had uncovered pressing down on her. The past few weeks had been a blur, full of tension, danger, and revelations that turned her life upside down. But today, as she addressed her colleagues, there was a sense of resolution in the air. The human trafficking ring she had uncovered was no longer just a case, it had become a national scandal. The scope of corruption, betrayal, and criminal activity within the highest levels of power had shocked the nation. With Gregory Phelps and Elaine Bishop in custody, Tasha had pieced together a network of criminals tied to corrupt government officials, high-ranking members of law enforcement, and international traffickers. The evidence she had gathered had led to multiple arrests and a massive investigation that would continue for months to come. But today, Tasha felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The truth was out, and the wheels of justice were finally turning. "I don't need to tell you all how significant this case is," Tasha began, her voice steady. "What started as a routine investigation into human trafficking has now exposed something much deeper, something much more dangerous. We're talking about a conspiracy that spans countries, agencies, and systems. This isn't just a victory for us, it's a victory for every victim who has been silenced by this system for far too long." Her colleagues nodded in agreement. They had worked tirelessly alongside her to uncover the connections, the hidden players, and the dangerous figures behind the trafficking operations. But Tasha knew that the battle was far from over. Though many key players had been arrested, there was still much work to be done. The corruption ran deep, and there were still countless victims who had to be rescued and given justice. "We've brought down a few figures," Tasha continued, "but this is just the beginning. We need to stay vigilant. We need to root out every last part of this operation, no matter where it leads us. And we need to make sure this never happens again." Her words were met with determined nods and murmurs of agreement. Tasha could see the fire in the eyes of her fellow agents, the same fire she had felt herself when she first took on this case. The weight of what they had uncovered was heavy, but it was also motivating. They were going to make sure the network was dismantled, that the truth continued to come to light, and that no stone was left unturned. Tasha paused for a moment, letting her words sink in before adding, "This case has changed the way I look at everything. It's not just about fighting crime, it's about fighting the systems that allow this kind of thing to thrive. We can't just put a few criminals away and call it a win. We have to make sure the system changes. That's how we truly win." The room fell silent for a moment as her colleagues absorbed her words. Then, the applause started, slowly at first, but it quickly grew, filling the room with a sense of unity and resolve. Tasha felt a deep sense of pride and relief as the applause washed over her. The journey had been long, and there was still more to do. But today, they had made a real difference. They had exposed a web of corruption that had plagued their world for far too long. And in doing so, they had taken the first step toward creating a future where these crimes could no longer hide in the shadows. She looked around the room at her team, her family of fellow agents who had fought alongside her. This was their victory, and it was one that would echo through the halls of justice for years to come. For Tasha, the journey wasn't over, but it was a start toward creating real, lasting change. And she was ready for whatever came next.